Congratulations, you have made it halfway through your Dopey training program. And I am convinced that training for the Dopey is the hard part. Let me explain. You see, once you actually get to the parks and there's all that energy and all those people cheering you on and you get to see the characters and have the yummy snacks and all that stuff, I'm convinced that that's the easiest part because you actually have people kind of pushing you along and motivating you along the way. But right now, when you're out there on your long run and there's nobody cheering you on and you're just listening to your music or your podcast and trudging through those miles, I feel like that's the harder part. So the fact that you've made it this far is fantastic. And since you're halfway done, your legs are probably pretty tired, so you might be sitting here watching this video and thinking, what do I need to be thinking about as I prepare for this Dopey challenge? So we want to do a check-in, make sure that you've got everything on board so you are all set for your Dopey challenge and to have the race that you want to have. So let's start there. In regards to running your Dopey, have you thought about what your strategy is? Now, everybody's strategy is different. Some people want to have that perfect Dopey, which means at the marathon, they are stopping for all the character stops, they're doing some rides, they're stopping for snacks along the way, and that is a perfect Dopey for them. In fact, I even heard about one woman who stopped for a steak while she was in Paris, which sounds pretty amazing and a little bit scary because I'd be a little bit concerned about getting swept if I stopped for an entire steak. But hey, if you are training for it in order to be able to be in front of those balloon ladies, then you can definitely do it. But what does success look like for you? Is it crossing the finish line? Is it crossing the finish line with a margarita in your hand after the marathon? That would be mine. Maybe for you, you're looking to get a personal record on one of the races. You may even be crazy enough to think you're going to get a personal record on all of the races. And if that's what you're training for, then I definitely believe that you can do it. But is your training matching up to what your goal is? Now, if you're following our training plan, you are getting into some pretty long runs. And I know that that's a bit of a controversial subject because some people don't believe that you need to do those long runs in order to successfully complete the Dopey. But again, what I would say is it goes back to what is your goal. So for us, our goal is to get a good time on our half marathon. And for the marathon, to have enough time to be able to ride the rides, greet the characters, and have the snacks, while also staying in front of the balloon ladies. So for us, we want to make sure that we have a lot of miles underneath our legs so that after that challenging half marathon day for us, we can still complete 26.2 miles. Now, I guarantee you our marathon is not going to be fast because, again, we're stopping to take the pictures, we're stopping to have the snacks, we're stopping to ride the rides, but we got to be able to run fast enough to be able to do those things and still stay in front of the balloon ladies. So if you haven't taken the time to figure out exactly what it is that your strategy is, I would encourage you to do so now because it's important when you hit that start line that you know this is what I'm geared up for today. So for our 5K and 10K days, it's really just get out there, finish the miles, enjoy the time out there, warm up our legs, nothing crazy. We cannot run too fast the 5K or 10K or we won't get the time we want on the half marathon. And we might not end up making it through the marathon because we're already too tired. So think about your strategy and what it is that you really want to accomplish so that you can make sure that your training is on point with that. The next thing is your gear check. So your shoes, your socks, your costumes. Do you have everything that you need and have you actually run the distance in it? So making sure that you have the shoes that you're going to run for that distance is incredibly important to make sure you've done it before you get to Dopey. Making sure you've got socks. We're going to talk about that more in a later video in regards to calluses and blisters. It's very important to make sure that you've done it before you get to Dopey. And when it comes to costumes, you want to make sure that you've already run that distance. So I bought this super cute skirt on Etsy and I absolutely adore it. But when I went and used it for a long run, I found that it was too slippery and my hydration belt kept slipping around. So what I realized is that super cute skirt is not going to work for a longer distance where I'm using a hydration belt. Now, that's fine because I'm not planning on taking my hydration belt for the 5K and 10K because those are shorter distances and I don't train with hydration for those particular races. So I've just moved that skirt to the 5K day so that way I can still wear the super cute skirt but not have to worry about my hydration belt slipping around for a half marathon or a marathon, which just would get annoying. So make sure you have used your costume, your socks, your shoes for the distance that you want to run or as close as you're going to get to that distance. If it's your marathon and your longest distance is going to be like 20, 22 miles, then that's fine. As long as you've used it for that long of a distance, you should be okay when it comes to the Dopey. The second thing that I want to make sure you have dialed in is your hydration while you're on the course. Now, some people want to rely on what Disney provides, and that's absolutely fine if you're flexible with what they're going to have on the course. For me, I like to know what I'm going to be using for my hydration, and I want to make sure that I've trained with it. And since they haven't announced yet what they're going to be using on the course, I'm going to make sure to bring my own. So I'm using Element while I run, and then I'm using Tailwind immediately following my run. So Tailwind has the glucose, which I definitely need after a longer run, but the Element has the salt, which I found when I ran my marathon that was my biggest problem. I did not have enough salt. So while I ran, I use Element. Afterwards, I use Tailwind, and that helps to keep my hydration levels where I want them to be for those longer races. Now, again, I do not use hydration for the shorter distances. You may need to, especially considering the fact that you're going to be running 4 days in a row, and it may be pretty hot and probably pretty humid while we're out there. So if you feel like you're going to need it, I definitely encourage you to be training for it. For me, for the 5K and 10K, I'll rely on the water that they have on course, and I feel confident that that'll be enough for me. However, afterwards, I will still make sure to down some Element so that I've got the salt I need for those longer races coming up in the next couple of days. The next thing that I want to make sure you have dialed in is that hydration prior to and after running, because it's not just while you're on the course that you need to be thinking about your hydration. Again, we have 4 races, 4 days in a row. So it's not just what you do when you're out there, it's also what you do afterwards and before. Especially if you're going to be going to the parks and enjoying some time in the park, what are you going to do to make sure that you stay hydrated? I definitely encourage taking a water bottle with you. When I'm in the parks on Thursday and Friday, I will have a water bottle with me and it will have Element in it because I want to make sure that I'm getting that salt prior to that half marathon and marathon day. Now, for me, I'm not going to be going into the parks, at least that's not the plan, after the half marathon, because I want to have enough time to go swimming, do some stretching, take a nice nap, because the next day is going to be a long one. So I want to make sure I'm ready for that. Everybody's different, friends, but you have to figure out what's going to work best for you. Just make sure you do that with your training. So now we've talked about hydration. Now we've got to talk about fueling. So at this point in your training, hopefully you've got your fueling locked in for your races. So do you need to have something on the 5K and 10K route? What are you going to take for the half marathon and the marathon? And if you're planning on relying on what they have on course, have you actually trained with it? Which they haven't announced exactly what it is yet, so that's going to be a little bit difficult, but you can look at what they had in the past years to kind of get an idea. For me, what I've decided is a Snickers bar while I'm standing in the corral before the half marathon and the marathon. I've got the Bob's bars that I'm going to be using while I'm on the course for the half marathon and the marathon, as well as UCAN. So I'm going to have a combination of different things. Of course, I'm going to have my Element and my water bottle, and I'll bring an extra stick to add to it throughout the course, especially for that marathon, because that's going to be necessary. But you want to make sure that you have your food dialed in at this point. or that you are actively working on it. Again, you do still have a couple months, so you have time to fine tune it and figure out what really works for you, but you want to make sure that you're training with it. I hope you get the message from this video. You want to make sure you're training with it. Don't get out there and have a gut buster just because you tried something that didn't work for you. Because seriously, nothing would be more frustrating than putting in all of this training and then having something like that happen. And if we've talked about food on course, we need to talk about food off course, especially as your mileage increases. And if you're following our training program, you're now getting into the sequence of running 4 days in a row. And if you're like me, you have noticed that if you don't keep your protein up and you don't keep your carbs up, by the time you get to that fourth run, it is super challenging to keep going and to get it done, no matter how much food you have in your belt. So we had our first week of doing the 4 days in a row. And on the fourth day, we ran a half marathon. That was actually a race. And I got to admit, as we were driving there, we were both a little bit concerned because this was the first time that we were running 4 days in a row. And then we were running a race. So we kept talking all the way out there. We're like, hey, it's just a training run. Don't worry about your time. It's just a training run. Don't worry about your time. Yeah. We were worried about our time because you see, I had my watch while I was out there, and what I realized when I turned around is that if I kept up this pace, I was going to have a personal record, something that I had not achieved for a long, long time, getting through a barrier that just seemed too big to get over. That was super motivating to realize that I could get over it at that point, but you got to realize that was on the half marathon. So if that happens to me when I'm doing Dopey, I have to keep in the back of my mind, the next day you still have a marathon to run. And you need to run it at a decent pace so you can stay in front of the balloon ladies so you can take the pictures and drink the margarita, right? Again, I'm really focused on my goals. Now, we both did finish that race with a personal record, which was fantastic, but it also was a warning that we have got to be careful about that when we're doing the Dopey. However, I felt fantastic when I was out there for the half marathon, mainly because I had hydrated properly, my nutrition was on point, I was sleeping enough, and I had actually trained for this. I did that same race a year ago and was super disappointed in my results. But the honest point behind that is I was not on point with my hydration. I was not on point with my nutrition. I had not been sleeping well. I had been stressing myself out, and I hadn't trained enough because I was so busy stressing myself out and doing all of the other things. So it really drove home the point that you've got to have all of these things dialed in to have the race that you want to have. And I know it's a lot to consider, so I definitely want you to make sure you're thinking about it now while we've still got a couple months to go. Now let's talk about those consecutive days of training. 4 days of running in a row is a lot, and you want to get your body ready for it. So if you're following our training program, you've seen that only every other week do we hit those 4 days in a row. This is because we don't want to overstress our bodies, and we want to make sure we have some recovery time while we're training, because we don't want to end up with an injury or something like that. But how you train is how you are going to get through this race. So I recommend whatever program you're doing, I highly, highly recommend that you are running, walking, or run walking 4 days in a row so you get your body used to doing that. And the last thing that I want to make sure you are on point with is your distance training. Now, there's a lot of controversy around this regarding the Dopey. Some people say you don't have to do a long distance. Some people say you do. Some people say you have to run longer than a marathon. Some people say all kinds of opinions are out there, right? And I understand. I'm only adding my 2 cents here. You have really got to figure out what works best for your body. And obviously, you've got to be mindful of what your body can tolerate. Here is my personal opinion, and here's how we have trained for marathons in the past and how we are training for the Dopey this time. I am a firm believer that if you are going to run or walk a marathon distance, that you need to have done 20 to 24 miles as your longest run or walk before you get to that point. Now, is that necessary physically for your body? Can the pixie dust carry you across the finish line? It might be able to, But the question is, can that pixie dust carry you across the start line? So when we did our marathon, we had done a 24-mile run before that. And I've got to tell you, as I was standing at that start line, I was so intimidated about that distance. My brain really, really got to me. And the only thing I could keep telling myself is, well, you've already run 24 miles. It's only 26.2. And yes, I do believe that pixie dust can carry you those last 2.2 miles. I 100% do believe in that. However, if you're standing at the start line for a marathon and you haven't done a long distance like that, it's going to be a much more difficult brain game for you to conquer in order to be able to get across that start line. I also believe that when your body is used to running that kind of distance, you get into that pace quicker, so you know, like, this is a pace I can maintain for a long period of time. And that's what happened to us with the half marathon. My pace at the beginning was pretty much the same as my pace at the end, even though my body was getting tired, because my body was like, this is my pace, I can continue running this, and I probably could have continued running further even at that pace. So I am a strong believer you need to run 20 to 24 miles if you're going to be completing a marathon distance. And I know that that's a controversial take. You have to do what's best for you, but really think about what's going to happen in your brain when you're standing at that start line. I think it's better to have as much training underneath your belt as you can, which means 4 days in a row with a long run at the end. Now, if you're following our program, we're getting up in some miles. And I know it's hard and you have to take that recovery time in between, but it's gonna be worth it when you are able to run that marathon the way you want to, make all the stops you want to, whatever it is that you wanna do, it's worth it to put in those miles beforehand. That way you can have a successful race and actually enjoy yourself instead of just dragging across the finish line. So I'm going to include links to all of the products that I discussed in here below so you can check them out for yourself. But I will say there's one caveat. Please make sure that you train with them before you actually get out on the course. Just because it works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And you want to make sure that your body is fueled up properly, hydrated properly, that you've slept enough, that your gear is on point. If you're going to run those miles right now anyway, why not use them to prepare you for a successful Dopey challenge?